Welcome to the panel discussion about the situation with sociology, I guess nationwide, maybe globally, but certainly different situation here, as I was about to tell you. And by the way, my name is JUKKA SAVOLAINEN. I'm the moderator of the sociology community with Heterodox Academy. And yesterday, in case you missed it, we had not one, but two sociologists winning these awards, winning a teaching award, Abigail Sagi, and a research award went to Musa, and they're all members. So here, the situation with sociology couldn't be more encouraging. But we're talking about what happened in Florida, and then of course, Florida, reflects what's going on in the country, especially now, type of thing. And the title, just to make sure that you're on the right panel: How should we respond to the cancellation of sociology by the state of Florida? And I suppose the "we" here means the heterodox sociologists. That's the idea here, okay? So it's very much in alignment with the theme of the conference, which has something to do with the tension between state power and academia. I will first give a little bit of background. I can't assume that everybody here is entirely up on what took place in Florida. So I'll give you a little bit of a short summary of what happened, what we call cancellation. It's a little bit of an exaggeration. And then I will introduce our panelists, they will all make short remarks regarding the matter. And then I'll have some questions, and finally, of course, open it up for audience participation. So just to summarize what happened in Florida, in early 2024, the Florida Board of Governors removed introductory sociology course called Principles of Sociology from its list of courses that satisfy the social science general education requirements in all public universities, in all universities in Florida. While sociology is still being taught, sociology, in other words, has not been canceled entirely. It has lost a key point of access to undergrad students. And it's worth noting that this happened. You may have all heard of the Stop the Woke Act, but this preceded it. Somehow, in the context of passing, or even before, this idea of specifically targeting sociology took place. So no single course. Since then, something like this likely has happened in Florida, as far as I know. But sociology was singled out as the first among equals regarding the sort of woke disciplines. So the rationale for removing sociology included concerns about ideological bias, lack of viewpoint diversity. I'm quoting from the Florida Board of Governors, which stated that the sociology course, which they removed, was guilty of, quote, exposing students to radical woke ideologies. And the Education Commissioner of Florida added fuel to the fires, arguing that the discipline of sociology had been hijacked by left-wing activists. The American Sociological Association, ASA, condemned the decision as political interference and a threat to academic freedom. But many critics, including some sociologists, argue that sociology has indeed become an activist discipline, less focused on scientific inquiry and more aligned with political agendas under the banner of social justice. So today's panel, that's the background of the Florida situation. So as you can see, this is sort of it's not about Florida per se, it's not about sociology per se. Just today, New York Times covered the Harvard tensions and how Trump administration, so there's similar, this sort of microcosm of what's going to sort of has happened since in the country regarding these tensions. So today's panel brings together four sociologists, myself included, each with a record of engaging with those debates. So let me introduce my fellow panelists here. We have Bradley Campbell, who's a professor of sociology at Cal State Los Angeles, ROSEMARY HOPCROFT, Professor Emerita at the University of North Carolina, Charlotte, and FABIO Rojas, who's the chair and professor of sociology at Indiana University. We'll start with each of them sharing some remarks, some observations about this Florida situation. And then I have prepared some questions, but this is meant to be a genuine discussion. I'm not necessarily going to go rigorously over each question and so on. So let's see how things happen organically, but that's the idea. And of course, at least 15 minutes or so I would like to share with reserve for audience participation. So maybe we'll start with Brad, and then ROSEMARY, and then FABIO.
Okay, so I'm Bradley Campbell, and I'm a sociologist at Cal State Los Angeles, as JUKKA said. And let me just start by saying a little bit about what I think of sociology, how I think of the subject, and some of my ideas in terms of orienting us toward how I'm thinking about the Florida situation. So for me, sociology is the science of social life. That's how I've always conceived of it. And as a sociologist, I try to describe and explain social reality. I'm a sociologist of morality, so my work has been focused on the handling of moral conflict. I'm interested in all the ways people react to what they define as deviant behavior. So people who see something as deviant, who have some kind of grievance, can negotiate, they can use violence, they can end relationships, they can appeal to third parties, and many more things. So in my work, I've studied phenomena like genocide, martyrdom, the handling of conflicts on college campuses, and so on. And I've always attempted to describe and explain these things. As a sociologist, I haven't tried to evaluate them. So I don't think that's what sociologists should generally be doing. I think the right approach is to try to describe and explain the social world. To critique the social world, to evaluate it, is just something different. And when we try to mix those things, or often people try to just skip to the critique, we can end up failing at sociology. That's my idea. So if you care about changing the world for the better, and I think we should care, you'll also fail at that if you mix these things. Sociology shouldn't be about activism, but I think good sociology can actually help in changing the world, and I'd argue it's even crucial. So my most recent book was called How to Think Better About Social Justice: Why Good Sociology Matters. Now, my original subtitle there was Why Bad Sociology Only Makes Things Worse, but my editor said make it more positive, and I agreed with that. But either title is actually fine. I do think I'm arguing that good sociology matters and bad sociology does make things worse. So I think sociology is important for a lot of reasons, but one of them is even if your main aim is to change the world for the better, we need to understand the social world. And in my book, I go over principles that we can derive from sociology to help us in this, to aid us. But I think that bad sociology actually will make things worse. I think there's lots of examples of this. And I've argued in particular that critical theory, which has come to dominate the discipline to an extent I wouldn't have imagined 20 years ago or so. And I think critical theory, and many other perspectives have different kinds of problems. And I think part of it is, if we accept its claims, we end up knowing less about the world. We have bad information about how the social world works. And we'll have false ideas about it. And so these ideas, so we'll even fail at our activist efforts if we employ them. So even on its own terms, critical theory and many other approaches like this can make the world worse. So if I look at something like what Florida is doing, this move against sociology, I'm sympathetic to some of the criticisms they're making, so to the hostility of the discipline as it is, and I know that's some of what's driving the decision makers in Florida. Some of what's driving it, but I also think sociology is important. It's what I do. It's what I spend much of my time doing, and I would rather not see it destroyed. So I don't want to see sociology destroyed. But it does have problems. I'd rather it become what it's supposed to be.
Yes, I totally concur with all of those statements. And I'm ROSEMARY HOPCROFT. I'm Professor Emerita from the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. And since I received tenure, I've been interested in testing theories from evolutionary biology in sociology. And as you can imagine, that's been not very popular. If you have any idea about the discipline of sociology, it has been very anti-biology, but I have been doing that, from the safety of tenure, at least while I was a faculty member. And I was particularly interested in sex differences from an evolutionary point of view, which, as you can imagine, was also not popular. In sociology, the received wisdom is that sex is a social construct. So this has helped lead to some of the worst excesses of the woke ideology, as you know. Anyway, what I wanted to say today is how should sociology respond to the cancellation of sociology by the state of Florida? Well, I feel like sociology should become useful to students as part of their general education. And I do think the basic sociological perspective that to understand social behavior or any individual's behavior, you have to understand that person's social context, and that means their group affiliations, their peers, their family, and so forth. And that the importance of the social in shaping the social behavior of individuals. I mean, this was the central motivation for the discipline of sociology ever since, Emile Durkheim's suicide, where he showed that something as individual as taking one's own life is greatly influenced by the social context. And he looked at suicide differences, the differences in rates of suicide across different countries. And he related that to the different social life, particularly the religious life in these different countries. So, I mean, I do think the sociological perspective is a valuable and useful one, and there is a need for the social science of the social, of the aggregate, not just of the individual as we have with psychology. And in the past, sociology has approximated more of a true social science and has produced a great many useful findings that I think students would find useful in their lives. Just some examples, the strength of weak ties in groups, the effects of small group structure on who has power in the group, patterns of the demographic transition, implications of the age and sex structure of the population for society, the effects of divorce on children, all sorts of very useful findings that I think would be helpful for students to know, and for them as an educated human, which is, of course, what the purpose of a general education is all about. Now, most of these findings were from traditional social science research in sociology and related disciplines, many of them using aggregate data sets and statistical methods. Of course, Emile Durkheim, when he was an early founder of sociology, he did use some rudimentary statistics in his famous book, Suicide. Basically, I just completely agree with Bradley that the more of a social science sociology is, the more useful it will be for everyone, for policymakers, for students. We have to understand the social world. That's necessary for good policy, at least. And I think it's helpful for individuals, as I said. So we should strive to be more, sociology should strive to be more of a social science as it used to. It should not take any political, ideological, or activist positions. This was the way it used to be, at least when I was a graduate student in the 1980s at the University of Washington. Maybe that was unique, but we really understood that we were supposed to be value neutral as social scientists, and I think that's exactly right. Sociology should be silent about questions of value. And values and ethics, of course, are very important and can be very important guardrails, but they're separate to the social science itself. And obviously we don't want to do unethical research or anything like that. But the point is these should be two completely separate domains, the social science and our values and morality. And I also think, given my own background, that sociology should be more open to relinking itself to the life sciences, particularly biology. And this is the way all science is done. It's science at every level of aggregation is always compatible with the science at the next lower level of aggregation. And so I think linking sociology to the life sciences, particularly biology, would help with the enterprise of making sociology more of a true social science. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Bradley and Rosemary, for those interesting comments. So I'm going to give a few comments here, and I'm very grateful to JUKKA for his introductory comments, because that's the first point I want to address. So within the discipline and within the public, what happened in Florida was called the cancellation of sociology. That is factually incorrect. And I believe that everybody here is interested in actual facts and what happened. You can still teach sociology. You can be as intersectional as you want to be. You can get tenured writing a dissertation or a book on Patricia Hill Collins. You could just go all out if you want in Florida and still get promoted and do okay. However, what did happen, and this is probably a better word for it, is we were not canceled. We lost a privilege. And the privilege is that in most university systems, there are general education requirements which require people to take courses in math, writing, the physical sciences, and so forth. And because they are required to do that for their degree, it's kind of a free pipeline of money and credit that goes to an academic department. So sociology, as far as I can tell, was not abolished or anything like that. There's no rule against teaching woke topics. You can still do it if you want. However, the Department of Sociology at Florida lost a privilege and lost a chunk of money and a chunk of credit hours. And anybody who's a department chair knows that you lose sleep when you lose credit hours. So I think I just wanted to make that very clear. And this kind of ties into a bigger issue, which is, well, if it wasn't canceled, why did they take the effort of going through all of this? Well, it's part of a symbolic struggle, right? So right now, I think, I know we're heterodox and maybe somebody wouldn't agree with this, but I have a hunch most of you would agree that we're at a very strong moment or intense moment of symbolic conflict, right? So why does Trump attack Harvard? Because Harvard's like the #1 wealthiest school in the country. If it wasn't Harvard, it would be something else, right? Why do people worry about trans bathrooms? Like it's an all-gender bathroom in my house, right? Because of the symbolism of it, right? There's something that triggers, and sociologists, so you should be very sensitive to that there's a lot of moral conflict, right? And so attacking sociology is an indicator that we are part of a symbolic struggle and a symbolic conflict, all right? So what are the possible responses to this symbolic conflict? So I want to review a couple of those because that was part of the homework assignment. And you're a good teacher because you gave out a good homework assignment, and it made me think. So let's start with the null hypothesis. We shouldn't do anything. Okay, Roy DeSantis and a couple of trustees in Florida passed a rule. Some department that I have no personal connection to lost some credit hours, life goes on. And and that's not a crazy response because I have no worry that sociology will be abolished or will not continue to exist. We're not living in a Soviet system, which, by the way, abolished sociology for a while. There are countries that did abolish sociology because it was too bourgeois, which is kind of an ironic thing. So we don't get love anywhere, right? Like they hate us here for being critical and they hate us out there for being too bourgeois. But I'm going to have my job tomorrow, right? So doing nothing is actually a reasonable response, right? Let me move to the next response. Gripes and complaining. That's probably the typical response in the faculty lounge. At most places, I don't know, it was like at your departments when this happened, but there was a lot of hand wringing, like, oh my God, did you read the news? You know, they canceled Florida, you know, or like they lost the general education designation at their campus. And most people understand the importance of it, but it just kind of ended there. One of the things that Yuka asked us to reflect on was the response of the American Sociological Association. They're kind of like the French government in a diplomatic conflict. They issue strongly worded letters that nobody pays attention to. And ASA, and I apologize, I'm a former employee. I've edited journals for ASA. But you know, there is a pattern of this where in the symbolic sphere, in the realm of cultural conflict, sociology will appear. Then there will be a strongly worded statement, and then life goes on. The last one that happened was when Justice John Roberts of the Supreme Court, I believe, said something like, you know, I'm not going to read social science research on a particular topic because it's sociological gobbledygook, right? And then, you know, Eduardo Bonilla Silva, who's a very prominent sociologist who was chair of the ASA, or not chair, but president of the ASA at that time, once again wrote a strongly worded statement, which didn't persuade John Roberts, didn't persuade anybody, but made us feel good. But anyway, there is a value for griping. You know, Mario Small, one of our colleagues at Harvard, you know, has a book about the benefits of social relationships, and griping is part of it. You know, it makes us feel better to be part, you know, maybe this is even a biological process. Like, we just feel better complaining to our friends about problems. And this is part of social bonding and whatnot. So griping may be a reasonable response. All right, so those are two responses, and maybe you're expecting a little bit more. So I'll give you a third response. What if we actually try to be better? And to say, okay, Roy DeSantis and those people in that realm of politics, they're playing games, they're in a cultural conflict, they do not really care or they're invested in sociology in any way. But what if we thought about it and said, why are we a good target? Why do people keep slamming us? Why are we gobbledygook? The other day I was watching a couple of Clint Eastwood movies, because he's a badass, he's amazing. But there are at least 2 or 3 movies where sociology is singled out for mockery, right? And this is interesting. In Any Which Way But Loose, there's a scene, and correct me, Clint Eastwood fans, where he goes to a bar and he encounters a sociology major who's studying the working class man in a demeaning way. So this goes back decades, where there's something about our reputation, our visibility, our symbolism, our presentation of self that makes us a really good target, really great target. So if you took this charge to be better, you first have to diagnose the problem, then you have to offer a solution. And I think Bradley and Rosemary offered a lot of great intuition about what the problem is. So I'm going to try to compress our PR problem into a fortune cookie saying, sociology is a bait and switch discipline. We say we're a universal discipline of social science. We say that we're a big tent where anybody can get any opinion published or have a good hearing. But when you show up, there's a bait and switch. You actually get a discipline which has certain intense foci. And probably the 2 foci that really matter the most are, number one, an extreme emphasis on social problems. And a Substack post, I think I call it like a museum of dysfunction. A student came up to me the other day and I was asking him, why did you sign up for this course? He said it was a course with a good title because the last social course I took was just poverty in Minnesota for 16 weeks. Literally, it's like, you're the first course I found that was not all doom and gloom, right? So there's an extreme emphasis in our discipline on social problems. If you, as empirical, I know some people in the audience, if you're empirical sociologists, you could look at, say, ASA Best Publication of the Year. You know, one of them was on racialized capitalism. Another one was on AIDS in Africa. Another one was on enslaved servants in the Philippines. And by the way, I know the authors of those books. They are top-notch, amazing scholars. I'm not saying they should ever stop what they're doing. But I was saying, as a collective, if that's all we do, we come off as jerks. We come off as negative Nellies. You know, just like we're just the people who kill every party, right? And there's a reason we do it, because we're rewarded for it. You get in the New York Times for writing about evictions and dysfunction. You don't get in the New York Times for writing about how to be a better person, okay? The second focus or emphasis of the discipline is what I like calling the monoculture of academia. And the sociology has a lot of it. So if you read various studies, something like 80 to 90% of sociologists will be on the left side of the spectrum. They're in one book, this is Shields and Passing on the Right. I forget the other. Yeah, there's a table, and it was like 0 libertarian sociologists. And so I'm just like, wow, that's really extreme, right? And like, it's easier to be a Marxist in sociology than to be a libertarian, right? There are probably more Marxists in sociology than there are conservatives. And I myself am not even a conservative, and I'm really surprised by that fact. So what I would say is that if you wanted to get past doing nothing and just griping, then the question is, how do you be better? And then everybody's going to have a different path, but you could encourage more people to go into academia. You could be a nicer reviewer when you get topics that don't fit your mold, right? You could advocate for job candidates who have strong records, but maybe are a little bit different than you. You could teach conservative or other non-progressive ideas in the classroom with a little bit more charity than other people might. There's no one way to do it. But I think that collectively, if all 5 or 10,000 of us sociologists, however many there are teaching in the universities, do all this, we get a better result. So thanks for listening.
Thanks, Fabio, and thanks for your preview. Some of the questions that I had, which is a good segue to. I have some questions here that I would like all of you to consider. And the first one is use your language. I just talk about a symbolic battle kind of thing. And the question that I have is, why do you all think that sociology was singled out as opposed to, say, anthropology or political science? Or so this is a Heterodox Academy conference. We're kind of here all with the understanding that there's something in academia that suffers from lack of viewpoint diversity. That's sort of the premise. But is sociology primus inter pares, first among equals, as far as social science is concerned? The other alternative, which I saw in responses, was kind of something you may have alluded to there, Fabio, that we are such a badasses or critical. We're so critical that the DeSantis, the conservatives, can't handle it, so we are kind of the subversive intellectual force, so that you can sort of flatter yourself that we're dangerous to the conservative agenda. That's why, or we're just an intellectual mush that doesn't merit. That was one of the arguments of woke discipline and whatever. So what's your take on it? It's a short take on that. If you don't have a take on, that's fine. But why sociology as opposed to so many other? Why was that the first target even before the Stop the Woke Act was? Yeah.
I was just going to say what Fabio said is that I think sociology has been the butt of jokes for a long time, and there's these other fields have become just as woke, but they're much smaller and people are much less aware of them.
Sure.
So.
I think it's probably the intersection of a couple of things, which is that we're a relatively large discipline. We're not like classics or ancient Greek or something, so we have a presence and whatnot. But also, it's just the relentless, nonstop focus on contemporary social problems, where maybe anthropology isn't. They're very current and contemporary, but they're less likely to say things people would recognize. And by the way, there's also a Monty Python sketch that makes fun of a sociologist, where Eric Idle says, "I'm a sociologist and I'm studying crime here." And then really silly things happen after that. And they make fun of the sociologist.
I think you mentioned, JUKKA, in your introductory remarks that the Florida Education Commissioner had said that sociology had been hijacked by left-wing activists. So that was the way they presented it. And we could all quibble with whether the discipline has been hijacked by left-wing activists. And I think people exaggerate some of this sometimes, from outsiders do. But I was just thinking, so one of the reasons I think that they are selecting sociology is I think they're in some sense right about what they're saying. Again, we could quibble with the terminology or the extent of it, but what would sociology look like if it were obviously not hijacked by left-wing activists, so that we could say, oh, that's just like a crazy thing the Florida Education Commissioner said. You wouldn't have, these are extreme examples, but you wouldn't have courses like, this is one at UNC Asheville, and it's whiteness, interrogating power and privilege. And you have, so I saw an article about this, and a student who was in the class, it was a very positive thing put out by the university about it, and a student in the class said, it's really hard to describe what whiteness is because it encompasses so many different things. It's an identity, it's a social structure, and a location. It's a status group, it's a system of power and privilege, it's an ideology. I mean, I could go on with this stuff, but this is that kind of course what you would have if you had not been hijacked by left-wing activists. So that's, I mean, I could give other examples, but I would say they're singling out sociology partly because sociology is at the extreme of some of the things they're opposing. It's not the worst discipline, but it's one of the worst big disciplines. I agree. Yeah.
Good. Next, I want to dwell a little bit on this ASA response, and I'm sure most of you probably haven't read it, or let alone memorized it, but so I give you a little background, but again, Fabio, you alluded to that with this sort of a bait and switch claim. So again, ASA condemned, obviously, as they should have, I mean, as a professional association, the Florida intervention as a form of academic censorship. They defended sociology as nothing other than a rigorous science of social life, the term that Brad used earlier. So this is from the document from, I think, 2023, when they were, the Board of Governors was open to comments. Science of social life with multiple practical applications. Okay, let me quote something here. Some how they specifically describe the science of social life and social consequences of causes and consequences of human behavior. They noted that its 10,000 members study such highly relevant topics as aging and life course, crime, technology, migration, health and medicine, and organization. And what's conspicuously absent in this document, they don't mention race, gender, or even inequality as central topics of sociology in this response to Florida. So my impression is, consistent with, I guess, yours, that ASA refused to confront the issue of ideological capture and chose instead to present sociology as a neutral science of social life. And I see there's an element of, shall we say, grotesque dishonesty there, or refusal to engage, but also a sign of hope, in a sense that that suggests that they know how they ought to behave, what the norms are, because otherwise they wouldn't be able to. And this was, I think, the three past and current and maybe future presidents of the ASA. I forget exactly who wrote these, but at least the present president and past. So at least they know when push comes to shove what they're supposed to be like. So that's sort of a hopeful sign. But overall, my question is, if you have is not what you think of the response, but also let's say that you were part of a group to formulate a response to this challenge. What would you say? So two-part questions, I guess. Do you have any observations about the ASA response, and how would you do it better?
Yeah, so thanks for that close reading of the response. And it brought up something that I think everybody should check out. There's a blog post by Philip Cohen, who is a professor of sociology, very prominent sociologist of the family. And he tracked membership in ASA sections. So the American Sociological Association has different sections that you can sign up for. And that statement says, we do health, we do migration, we do all this stuff. But in practice, what are people signing up for? The only sections that have increased, with a few exceptions, are all having to do with inequality, poverty, race, and gender inequality. So that's the bait and switch. So when we poke sociology, they're like, no, we're a general social science. But when you look at the membership, they're voting with their feet. Now, there are a couple of exceptions. I think like the social religion section saw an increase, and a couple of the small sections like mathematical social saw an increase. But there's that bait and switch. And what would I have done different? I think I actually would have owned the activism. I would have said, I'm proud of some of the activism that's been done in the discipline. I think that's great. But we also do the other stuff. It's a big tent field. So that's my opinion on it.
Yeah, I was actually surprised when I saw the statement from the ASA, not just that they emphasized sociology as a science so much, which hadn't been the direction of the ASA. But even this phrase, the science of social life, that's the phrase I use. I mean, I think it comes from Durkheim. My advisor, Donald Black, used it a lot. I don't even hear it a lot from people who are more scientific in the discipline, but then the science of social life. So in a sense, that's exactly the response I would have given if I were defending the work that I like in the discipline, or that I think is of value. But it is the bait and switch aspect is the problem. The year before this happened, or maybe it was the upcoming meeting, but around the same time, the American Sociological's annual meeting had a theme that was intersectional solidarities, building communities of hope, justice, and joy. Well, that's the title. But in the description of it, it emphasized that sociology is a form of liberatory praxis, not the science of social life, liberatory praxis. And it said it was an effort to not only understand structural inequities, but to intervene in socio-political struggles. So they're basically then, that's kind of what the people in Florida were criticizing. So if I were responding, I mean, I would, first of all, I agree with much of what the people in Florida are saying about the discipline, but I basically respond just like the ASA did, is just that much of the work that's going on that the ASA has promoted isn't that at all, right? It's not even intended to be scientific. They often attack the idea of sociology as a science.
I personally think that activism, I know that I just don't think activism should be in sociology, period. I mean, what people do in their private lives is fine, but it shouldn't be in the classroom. It shouldn't be at the ASA. That's just, it seems that it's too tempting for it to hijack everything else, which is what's happened.
To that point, as an observation for those who may not be in sociology so much, this is not a question, but maybe it elicits some commentary, but my understanding is there was a kind of a significant turn in circa 2004. I think it was Michael Burawoy gave as the president of ASA, a speech on public sociology, and it sort of formalized and mainstreamed, and the idea of public sociology sounds neutral, right? We're doing something that's relevant for the public, but in practice, it's this sort of a left-wing activist agenda. You don't see public sociology of the conservative kind or neutral kind or so much. We see public policy, of course, as an area of discipline, but public sociology in practice, de facto, is this sort of social justice activism. And I think that's something that started happening after that. That became sort of the vogue thing. And I think we haven't necessarily recovered from that. I think, I guess is that, do I have it right? I've spent time in other departments too, so is that?
Well, when I read the history of the discipline, I think the story is a lot more complicated than that. And the Burawoy moment was a key turning point, but the social problems approach to sociology has been present from the beginning. It is not an isolated thing. So you read the Chicago school people, you read people like Jane Addams, who are often brought into sociology. And the way it's been explained to me, because this precedes my time, is like maybe the first or another wave of it was the 1970s. We talked about this the other day, like a post-Parsons moment, that that style of sociology didn't permit for political critique and whatnot. So the founding, the 1970s, and then you call that 2000s era. And by the way, for people who have not read his address, I teach it all the time, so I've read it with a very fine-tooth comb. And Bradley is, and JUKKA are correct that this is another kind of bait and switch where you look at the top, this is public sociology. You might think this is about scientific communication, but there's a passage in there where he says, that in the same way that economists defend markets, which by the way, they don't, they think market failure is all over the place. They think market, they're there to correct it. So Michael gets that part wrong, but he says in the same way that economists defend the markets, sociologists and public sociology have to defend society against the market and the state. So it's a kind of, So it's not merely saying that, it's not a translational project where you say, and he says, like, there's professional sociology, right, which is what we might call value-free sociology. And he says that's a good thing, you should do that. But he's advocating for an additional style of sociology, which is about the defense of the civic or the civil against the market process or state oppression. And that was a big thing. It's now been cited like 10,000 times or something. You can go on Google Scholar and see.
In one of his publications about it, he says, he even uses the word democratic socialism, that's what you would be defending, yeah.
And even if you were, I would say, even if you were honestly embracing the idea of public sociology, if you're operating in the field where the ratio of left-wingers or Democrats leads to conservatives is 60 or 52 to 1, it's probably not the ideal field where you would encourage people to engage in public discourse because it's so politically skewed. Anyway, I would rather have an economist be a public doing, because at least it's 5 to 1 or something like that there. Anyway, so on that note, let's talk a little bit about what I asked about how would you respond, but what about the field itself? How would you engage with critics? Of course, we have already touched on these things, critics and skeptics about the future of sociology. How can we productively engage when it's seen as ideologically captured? Are they internal reforms, curricular, methodological, institutional reforms that might restore public trust and credibility? We're all members of HXA Sociology. We had a little pre-conference symposium. We talked about some of these issues. Is there a role for our growing community to play in reforming sociology, and how would you go about it? Just any baby steps will do.
I was just going to say, as I said, there used to be strong norms in the discipline that we were a social science, at least in my graduate school training. And it's fine to study social problems, but you do so as a social scientist. And you check your ideology at the door. So and I understand that sociology has long been linked with the study of social problems, and that's fine. But, we have to separate the ideology from the science. That's just basic. We just need to go back to stressing those norms, and I don't think sociologists should be encouraged to do social activism or try to do politics or anything of that in those realms.
I think that if we agree, and we might not all agree on this, that sociology has a big problem, or even that it's in some sense been hijacked by left-wing activists, as the commissioner in Florida said, or again, even to some big degree. I don't have a great solution. I can think of 3 kind of general strategies, and I see problems with all of them in terms of results. One is that we can just go underground, right? We keep trying to practice the sociology that we want to practice, that we think is valuable. I mean, we could think of it as staying underground, because a lot of people are doing this anyway. So you try not to say anything too controversial before you get tenure. Then maybe sometimes you have findings that go against what people might expect. Maybe you try to always frame it so that you can sell it as something that's consistent with progressivism. So maybe it sneaks by, and you kind of hide, and maybe occasionally use legal measures if somebody's getting fired for their viewpoints or something. But mostly you just try to get along and try to avoid a controversy. And that's obviously not a winning strategy. It doesn't seem like a long-term strategy to keep the field from becoming worse. And it leaves it vulnerable to outside attacks, right? We might end up being sacked by barbarians, or not that the people in Florida are barbarians, but you get the metaphor. You go underground. The other option, and I've seen a lot of people discuss various versions of this, is schism. You try to create the alternative institutions. So we leave the ASA and we create some other organization. We try to create new journals. Maybe you create new departments, new disciplines, or maybe it's even new universities. And the problem I see with that is that as you're leaving these institutions that are already established. You're marginalized in various ways. And then the third option is Reconquista, right? You think of it as we actually take over and change sociology and make it what we think it should be, and that is obviously a big challenge. Maybe it's a long-term strategy. If you're doing that, then the way I see is you don't leave the ASA. And I've noticed, like, I haven't been to an ASA meeting in a while, and every time, many of the people I respect most in the discipline, I end up finding out they don't go either. But that's a problem if we're always leaving the institutions and retreating in some way. If we give the journals over to them, and I think so that's, I think those are the three broad options. I don't see that either that it's likely to be successful, but maybe we try. Maybe it's a long-term strategy, either some kind of schism where we create a new discipline, if that's a possibility, or some kind of reconquista.
So I'll make two recommendations. One is to read, and I'm sorry I forget the name of the actual article, but W.E. Du Bois had a great article about being an activist scholar. And you'd think as a revolutionary socialist, he would have been like, yeah. He's like, no, don't be an activist scholar. Why? Because activism and political engagement in the academy delegitimizes the science. He's very clear. He's like, I'm a really committed socialist. If you read his works, like, he was super committed. But he said, but when I create facts and when I do research, that has to have a pretty solid foundation. And when I read that, I'm like, wow, that's, interesting coming from somebody who is associated with scholar activism. So he didn't say that people couldn't have opinions. He didn't say you couldn't bring your facts or research to the public. He couldn't say that you create policy work or even do Borway-style political sociology. But he said, but at the end of the day, the legitimacy of what you do as a scholar depends on the quality of what you produce. And you shouldn't contaminate that with bias. And more importantly, you shouldn't turn us into, and what he meant with scholars in general, turn us into a big target for people to shoot at. Then the other thing I might recommend in terms of making things better is lean into service. And this is an idea that came up earlier this weekend in our discussion, which is that if you really care about the version of sociology that many of us might advocate on this stage, take over a journal and just do it better. Volunteer for an ASA section. Show up to that faculty meeting, right? And you're not going to win every battle, but on the margin, you'll make some big differences. And I'm glad that I do it. I think secession is an interesting idea. I don't think it's one that I will personally pursue, but I don't blame other people for doing it. However, I do think that if you have a strong foundation of a discipline, and by the way, I think sociology is amazing. There's just like a lot of great people doing great work. Let's cultivate that, find the best parts, promote that. And you'd be surprised at how many people might be interested in doing that if you took the time and effort to reach out to them. Not everybody will agree. Some people think you're a kook, but I think it's worth doing.
Thank you. If I can weigh in a little bit on this one as well, I think all of the above. I mean, it's not a either or, internal, external, or all the strategies that Brad outlined. I guess one can do, every single individual can engage in all of them, more or less. And I think my sense is that what's been happening, how this sort of capture, if you want to call it that, has happened, is a lot of sort of serious and sort of social science of social life minded folks have sort of tried to just carve out their niche and protect themselves from the activism. And I see a lot of these sort of subgroups of sociology scholars being formed who just want to carve out kind of a safe space where they can do the science of social life, but the larger field has been turning into more activist, and I think that's been a mistake. I think we ought to be more assertive, and I think this Heterodox Academy group is one example of that. And just mentioning as far as parallel institutions in Germany, sociology. The sort of, I think it's more of a quantitative or more sciencey, quote unquote, sociologists establish their own association, and maybe there's room for something like that. But I don't think, I think we could do just don't hide in the closet and just be assertive about. And we can be a little Machiavellian and try to fight for the. Did you have a comment there?
Yeah. If I may, I appreciate everything that's being said, and especially Fabio, what you were saying at the end about getting involved in service, et cetera. One thing that I haven't heard us speak to, but I think is a huge part of this problem and solution, is graduate students and who we are admitting and how we are training. And I myself have been part of the problem in the past. I think many of us were really drawn to the activist students and actively recruited them, and maybe we want to rethink that a little bit, and be serving on grad admissions is one way to do that. And then also, if you're teaching when I was in graduate school, we talked about this and read Science as a Vocation. We didn't have the Du Bois, but that sounds like a great thing. So both in the training of the students and in this selecting, that seems to be a really important part of the puzzle.
Okay, thank you. All right, I think I have one last question before I open it up, and it's more of a high-level question that's emanates from this particular Florida kerfuffle, but very much touches on the main theme of the conference. But I guess in the context of the Florida action, at what point do you think it's appropriate for government to intervene in higher education curricula, including sociology departments, on the grounds of viewpoint diversity or ideological bias, where you draw the line between legitimate oversight by the government versus interfering with academic freedom?
Yes, I'm just going to come out pretty hard and with a few opinions. And these are opinions, they're not well-researched statements or anything. Number one, if it's a private institution, hands off, period. Number two, I really believe in professional autonomy. If something is really crazy, then, maybe there should be some public discussion. But I believe it's good for professionals to make mistakes. We hire doctors to be in public hospitals, and sometimes they'll push bad medicine. But we say, let the scientific process, let the medical process weed out the bad practices. At the same time, my other strong opinion is that if you're in a state chartered institution, expect political interference, because that is the definition of the institution. So for example, if I were teaching at the University of Notre Dame, I could say Indiana is a horrible place, but as chair at a department or a subunit Indiana, I love our team. I love Indiana, and I hope we win the NCAA finals next year. It would be inappropriate for me to go and trash our state. I could critique it in a way. So what I tell people is that when the legislators start pushing back, I tell people, I do respect professional autonomy. I do believe that we know more about social science than the legislature does, but you should have expected this coming, because they write our paycheck. They gave us the land that we teach on. We're taking tax dollars. So you have to expect some form of input from the political system, even if it's not what you agree with.
And also, as you said, they just took away a privilege. They did not ban sociology in Florida yet. That's, as you say, they pay the bills. I do think, they have a right to say whether they think something is useful as part of a student's general education or not, given that they're largely paying for this general education. So,
yeah, I think I basically agree with everything Fabio said. That's generally my perspective too, to support professional autonomy, and especially to worry about state interference, right? That they won't do it well, even if it were justified. The issue. So if we think about the analogy that John Tomasi was making last night about the monasteries and the dissolution of the monasteries in the 1500s in England. If I think about that, so Jukka asked, is it right or is it appropriate for government to interfere? We could talk about the morality of that. We could ask the same question about the dissolution of the monasteries. Should they have been dissolved? It doesn't really matter. They were, right? So in a sense that something is the predictable consequence of a certain state of affairs, we need to respond to that. I mean, I think people often talk about moral and political questions in the abstract as if other people don't exist, and you can just think about, well, what should everybody be doing here, and rather than strategizing according to what other people's response will be. So sociology, I think, if it's going to be subject to attacks by the government, and partly, even if it shouldn't be, if sociology is doing something wrong that is inviting that, then it still should correct, and just for strategic reasons. I also don't think that, I mean, and then these are just moral questions, but we can disagree, but I don't think something like professional autonomy, academic freedom, those are good things in a certain context. But I mean, for me, I don't think of it as something as absolute as freedom of speech or freedom of religion or something. I mean, I could say that I don't want to ever see somebody burned at the stake for their religious views. I don't know that if you have academic freedom, professional autonomy, because it is working in a certain sense, right, to advance certain interests. If the universities become corrupt enough, I mean, so should the monasteries have been allowed to control 25% of the land? Should nothing have ever happened and they still have 25% of England or something? It's sort of an irrelevant question, but I also would say no, something needed to be done there. It probably was not done well. But I think there are different kinds of historical circumstances. I don't know if we're there yet, but I can see a situation where you would say, yes, the government should interfere here. And there is a difference between private and public universities. There's also a lot of public support for private universities and different ways that the government can withdraw that and manipulate certain outcomes. But again, I don't know if it's kind of an absolute thing that we would say never ever should they intervene under any circumstances. It kind of depends on what we do.
Yeah, I'm seeing Jonathan Roush, if I got your name right, in the audience, and so I'm using the terminology from his book, Constitution of Knowledge, that I think there's a legitimacy to intervening as long as there is very strong evidence of systematically violating the Constitution of Knowledge. In other words, the statement by ASA argue that they imply that they adhere to this pure science of social life, and if you can make it clear that this is not what's happening and they're abusing academic freedom, maybe there's a reason a responsibility to intervene. And so I was trained in Helsinki, Finland, a Nordic country, in the late 80s, undergrad and early 90s. So I'm familiar with this case that happened in Copenhagen in the 80s, where they actually shut down their 2 sociology departments through the top-down process, but they consulted with experts, renowned experts across the Nordic countries. One of my professors or mentors was in the panel, so they did make a judgment. So this Department of Justice in Denmark appointed top-down these sort of more positive, not Marxist social scientists, welfare state, political sociologists, and so on. From Stockholm, Helsinki, and so on, Oslo, and they came to the determination that this is a cesspool that's not really meeting the expectations of what a functioning sociology department should be. They shut it down and rebuilt it, and right now Copenhagen is an excellent model, I think, of what's going on there. I'm not an expert on that, but the people I know are. It's a good-looking sociology department, if you ask me, in Copenhagen. So that would be, to me, a success story of a well-justified intervention. Anyway, so on that note, I think I do have some questions here and there, but I think I'm getting a sense that maybe there's some audience participation here too. So. I'm not sure about this mic thing. I could be a Phil Donahue, if I can use that reference, and walk around here with the mic, but maybe we won't bother with that. So it's being recorded. That's what I'm concerned about. But let's see. I'm going to use my sociological privilege. And Frank, maybe you can ask the first question there.
Frank Wagner at Emory University. I have two comments.
Yeah.
I'll offer perhaps to trigger your responses. First, the original issue, of course, was the removal of sociology from the core curriculum requirements in Florida. So I looked at the syllabi of introductory sociology courses in Florida, and even though I can't tell from the syllabi exactly what goes on in those courses, my sense is that they're very similar to introductory sociology courses elsewhere. And the problem with those courses, not first and foremost, I believe, that they are super activist or super political, but that they're trivial mishmash of topics, not rigorous, not critical, not offering inconvenient facts. That is what's lacking much more than the political signature or profile, although I'm sure there are sociology instructors who teach the intro in that way. So we do need to do better, but better especially in real critical, offering a model for real critical thinking. So that's my first comment. The second, and so I think it's understandable for other reasons as well, why Florida eliminated the sociology requirement. And of course, the other question is relative to what? We may think that as sociologists, we may think that sociology is extremely important, but I also think it's important for people to know about the American Revolution. For many years, my own institution has not taught a single course on the American Revolution. And so the weighing of the pros and cons is significant. The second point I would make is that even though I greatly sympathize with your comments, is that I think the contrast between they are doing activism and we want to do science is too simple. And that one reason is that a lot of the activists, as I think Fabio alluded to, a lot of the activists also do very good science. And historically, the science and the activism have been strongly intertwined. They're not so easy to separate. I'm afraid to say this, even though my own position is more Weberian. Bourgeois, of course, also offered a third category of critical sociology. And I think what we should push is, and what you are in fact doing, I think, is to develop this critical self-examination of sociology. And so ironically, it's the heterodox sociologists that are being the more critical sociologists of the kind that I think Bourgeois also thought we have to develop. In any case, so the triviality of sociology at the info level in Florida is one issue, and the perhaps too simple contrast between activism and science is the second issue.
Thank you. Yeah, I like to take the mantle of a true critical sociologist here. Question authority. Anyway, anyone want to comment on that? Or
yes, well, part of the problem with the focus on trivial topics, is because sociology is no longer being a proper social science, and so often the focus is on weird groups and unusual practices and so forth, and it's no longer on the science of the focus is no longer on the science of the social. So I think that's the two things go together, why you see all these trivial topics being covered in intro classes and other sociology classes.
I think just real quick, one of the so the original reason for Heterodox Academy, I think it came out of Jonathan Haidt and some other social psychologists were first talking about their own discipline and its political skew. And the idea wasn't that people were necessarily activists and distorting the discipline in that way, but that because it was so skewed that people often didn't question things that they would otherwise question. The concepts got, the subject matter, all those kinds of things got selected in a certain way that was distorting the ability to do good science. So I think we're talking, some of the issues I'm talking about here, I'm responding, this is how the Florida Commissioner of Education described it, hijacked by left-wing activists, and I'm thinking about to what extent has that happened. I think there's actually other problems with the discipline, even when it's not left-wing activism and it's people trying to do good science and often doing good science. I think still there's a constriction in the topics and some of the other problems that you talked about.
All right, we had a couple in the front row, early birds here. So first row, second row. Okay, you go first.
Okay. Hi, Joe City from Penn University.
Do you want to take this?
Okay. Just 3 quick comments. I think what really makes people angry as sociologists is not so much like the weird classes, but I think what happens to people like, say, Mark Regnerus, where they really like make you like an unperson. And not only do they target Mark Regnerus, University of Texas professor, but they also target all his graduate students. So nobody wanted to work with him. That's number 1. Number 2 is when you talk about underground schism and reconstitute. Anyway, that sounds like Hirschman's tripology, exit, voice, loyalty. And I'm wondering if we can go beyond that. So for me, I'm working on a concept like bounded exit, bounded voice, which is that, I think it's important to remain members of ASA, but then have alternative organizations to so have us, have kind of like safe exit options, but we're still connected. And so for that, I think a good example is Ohio State. They're establishing like the Chase Center, these new civic centers. I applied to the Chase Center. They told me they had 800 applications. Right. So I think that shows me. So my final comment is that one of my students, she took my class and she said like I was going to be a doctor. Now I want to be a sociologist. And so what I wanted to reply to her was that I think it's important that we can offer like kind of like decent jobs and decent journal options. So smart people like her, we can encourage them to be sociologists instead of doctors. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm gonna just move on to the next question. You had a question there in the. Yeah. I nominated you already, so.
I'm just wondering if you could comment on, early you were talking about kind of the reputation sociology has, the way people mock it, and and a lot of that is because of the ideological bias. Another way, though, sociology has a negative reputation. Is a lot of people do just think, at least at the undergraduate level, it lacks the academic rigor that you might find in other disciplines. The joke is that it's what you major in if you couldn't handle chemistry or economics or whatever. And I think that has contributed to a negative reputation for sociology. And I'm just wondering if you have any comments on that.
Yeah, sociology is sort of a free-for-all and
right. So I've actually explored this issue at my university by looking at things like GPA and that sort of thing. And the conclusion I came to is, number one, there's huge variation. There are some universities where the soc major is really just not impressive. It does fit the stereotype you mentioned. What I discovered about sociology at Indiana University is that it is the hardest major that does not require a bunch of math. So if you look at things like who has the lowest GPAs, and you look at surveys of what majors get complained about, it's always econ, chemistry, physics, those have the lowest GPAs and the sort. Right after that, sociology, and I started thinking like, what's the difference? Well, I bet if I really sat down with the microscope, I could find some instructors who teach in the way that ROSEMARY described, with like mishmash, not very good stuff. But we require undergraduates to have at least 2 courses in statistics. I teach undergraduate social theory, which is painful. Not in the original German for Weber, but we do make them read the original texts. We have a pretty strict requirement to get an honors thesis there. People seem to have pretty rigorous standards in terms of teaching, mainly writing. We also teach a lot of intensive writing. So a lot of, I've had students come up to me and say, this is the first C on a paper I've ever gotten. It's like, I'm surprised because it's garbage. And I say, but it's not, I'm not slamming you, is that we all write garbage, and teaching writing is about the process of self-editing, right? So I think sociology can be more rigorous. It'll never be as competitive as like a math-based major or something like that, but it can be way more respectable. And computer programming, we teach people how to code a little bit. But once you get rid of those, then you allow all the mishmash to come in.
Just a quick thing. Do you? Mark Bauerlein. I'm a new trustee at New College. I actually advised the Board of Governors on the general education decisions. Do you think that if sociology, and instead of digging in their heels, that they had actually moved or pledged to move the field locally or broadly in the very direction heterodoxy advises, that the Board of Governors would put it right back in?
Yeah, so you have to first make a decision about whether the Board of Governors are good faith actors. And one thing that we know about campus activism, especially from the right side, and I'm going to rip off Amy right here. That's Amy Binder. She's a great social movement scholar. Her last book documented the idea that conservative students are often plugged into an external ecosystem of websites and media and right now that want to see controversy. So if you're on the Board of Governors or trustees and that's your audience, it doesn't matter what sociology is going to say. We could be the most virtuous group ever, and we would still get the cold shoulder. However, well, hold on, but I said that's a hypothetical. I didn't say it was true. I said you have to make a decision and you have to figure out if it's true. That's what I said, right? But if they're good faith actors, then I think that would have mattered, right? So for example, I'm going to do a little bit of self-advertising. That I recently published an edited volume on sociology and classical liberalism. And I was able to get some pretty skeptical editors to buy into it because I recruited a group of sociologists, including people like John Iceland, who's up there, contributed a great chapter on poverty, to say, like, these are sociologists using the best data, the best arguments, and we can put together something good. And that's something that persuaded people to publish this, even though the editors would say, like, I didn't quite agree with this, but this is like an interesting perspective. I can see you guys are trying really hard. So that's what I would say is that, first, why is that person promoting that point of view? Are they doing it for clicks or are they doing it for academic discourse? And here's what I would say. If you are a truly good faith actor, my phone number is bleep, bleep, bleep. Please talk to me afterwards. I've actually spoken to other conservative trustees about this at other campuses. So if you actually care about improving sociology in Florida, there's 3 people who would love to talk to you. And I'm just going to put down the olive branch right there.
4 people.
4 people, thank you. We're not good at math, so sorry about that.
Yeah, so I don't know the answer to the question, but I think we can, it's just hypothetical. But what's not hypothetical is for New College of Florida to sponsor, to invite heterodox sociologists to build or a program of sociology out of these principles, and then we can find out. Okay, so I think you gentlemen here has been patiently waiting, and I think Jonathan is after that.
Thank you. I'm a political scientist, not a sociologist. Tariq Masood, I teach at Harvard University. I want to pick up on a distinction that you made, Fabio, between the public and the private. And you said, because you teach in a public university, it would be inappropriate for you to, say, criticize the state of Indiana. Whereas for a private university, you said, quote unquote, hands off. But I think Brian kind of got to something that I was thinking about. Well, look, I mean, Harvard, as we know, gets a lot of money from the federal government. And so does that distinction break down? Is it not appropriate for a sociologist or a political scientist at an institution like Harvard that gets massive support from the federal government to do something like criticize the government of the United States of America? And so you see where I'm going with this. Like, okay, thank you.
So I think this is where we would deviate from a panel commentary and a well-reasoned journal article argument. And so there's a continuum of speech and discussion. And maybe the right way to say it is that if you're working in a public institution, the things that you should be cautious about will be a larger zone than the ones that you could do if you're in a private institution. Also, there is the entanglement of money, right? So, and I think there's also, once again, good faith arguments, bad faith arguments, high quality arguments, and low quality arguments. And you would have to think carefully about those criteria to kind of come up with the line. And this is not something you can do ex ante. Like, I can't tell you like what forms of speech would be completely okay. But for example, if somebody, if at Notre Dame, there was a course on anarchism and getting rid of the Indiana state government, I would say, don't complain about that. That's their academic freedom. But if somebody approved that at my university, I would say, let's talk about that. Let's exercise some caution, because we have a mission, and it's to support our people at the state of Indiana. That may be a waffly answer, but that's how I would approach it.
We have at least one more question or comment. We'll see how. Jonathan, go ahead.
Jonathan Roush. Thank you all. For what it's worth, Lee Jussum has launched an alternative social sciences journal. There are other moves in that direction. I think it could be a very positive thing to begin setting up alternative professional associations, journals, and so on. My question is, I'm on the board of Heterodox Academy, and the hardest question I get, which I really don't have an answer to, is in disciplines like sociology, anthropology, to say nothing of communications and the studies fields, the graduate student pipeline is even more left-wing ideological and captured than the existing professoriate, so the future looks even worse. First of all, is that the case in sociology? And second, how does one begin to change the pipeline so that you can get more diversity of viewpoint?
I think you're right that that's the big obstacle. And I first, some of the extreme examples, I mean, there were always problems, and I always had critiques of the discipline. But the extreme kind of thing that people have now call social justice warriors and things of that nature, I first started seeing it when I was a grad student from graduate students, not from faculty, right? And it was even then, this was in the mid-2000s, and it was a small number of graduate students. And then that seemed to kind of grow. I was at the University of Virginia, where there were more and more, and I would hear things, and then people would like get mad at somebody said at a colloquium and file a charge or something, and this was all new. And then more and more of those people are faculty, and then at my current institution, when I started there, it wasn't as bad in the way that I would think, and then now it's more because that's the pipeline of students, graduate students, and then faculty. And so I don't know. That's the big challenge. How do you turn this around when everybody disagrees with you? So not everybody. Almost. I think we're vastly outnumbered. Most people think the discipline is fine, or maybe that it should even be more activist.
May I speak to an intervention? Thank you. Hi, my name is Amy Binder, and I'm at Johns Hopkins University, and I have a colleague, Steve Tellis, who's been working on these issues. And one of the interventions he's thinking about is having folks create kind of coalitions around the country. So identify brave faculty who are willing to take on graduate students who come in with heterodox ideas and try to go recruit these students from places like the Hertog Foundation, AEI, American Enterprise Institute, talk with cohorts at these think tanks and other kinds of programs and tell them that they're willing to work with them on topics like military sociology or community policing or religion or what have you. So things that have been neglected in the discipline, and there is work afoot at this level.
Thanks for sharing that example. Yeah, I think my answer would be people respond to incentives, and if you're a serious social scientist interested in the science of social life, and I know people like this who have started as sociologists and moved on to epidemiology or economics or what have you. So you have to create, it's not just, they're smart people. They think about what kind of training they're going to get in grad school, what kind of jobs are they going to get if they are not of certain type. So I think the only way to, at least a clear way to do it is money or resources or create pipelines. However you do that is difficult, but that's my only reaction to that. People respond to incentives.
Yeah, can I add one extra comment about changing the pipeline? And I've been obsessed about this for about 20 or 30 years now. But I'll just say this one thing. Play the numbers game. Because fact number one, yes, occasionally there will be a conservative or non-progressive graduate student weeded out of an application pool. Like, it happens, right? But if you just have good grades and good GPAs, they want you. What faculty member doesn't want somebody who's, especially in sociology, who's good at math and can do the regression class? Like, who doesn't want that? So you play the numbers game, you just get a bunch of people to apply. Then, of course, a lot of those people not finish the graduate program, but some of them will. And then what you do is you really train them hard on getting into the right journals. And usually most people can work in fields where there's a reasonable intersection between the way they want to do things and the way the mainstream wants to do it. And then once again, that's a numbers game that, yes, there's always some hiring committee that will weed people out on inappropriate grounds, but most of them just want to know, did you publish an ASR? That's like a golden ticket in our discipline. You can publish anything in ASR and it will get you a job somewheres, right? And then of course we know that tenuring rates are about 90% in this country. No joke. So the point is you just got to play the numbers, and once you get into the system, they will tenure you conditional on quality work. And there are a lot of fields where people could work without a lot of flack, like demography, family studies. Mark Recknish is kind of an extreme example, and I have my own opinion about that. But most people, if you just want to write about divorce, go for it. You'll be fine.
So I'm going to end on an optimistic note regarding the pipeline. It kind of ties into your question about the undergrad rigor, too. My first teaching job was at Western Washington University, and they used to have, they probably don't have anymore, all right? They used to have a Bachelor of Science track of requiring more math-heavy courses. Again, I don't think it's all about quantitative, by the way, just to be clear. That's not my point at all. I don't equate research integrity with quantitative, okay? But just as an example, we had in Western Washington University a track, Bachelor of Science track, which was demographically oriented in demography. Douglas Massey graduated from Western Washington University. Jay Teachman graduated from Western Washington. More recently, Jacob Cheadle, who's a University of Texas Austin, kind of does his biosocial stuff, is from that program. And there was a pipeline to Penn State. A lot of Penn State. We went to Penn State for grad school. So you could create these type of things at least. Try to be more. I'm not saying that demography is the only one, but that's probably one of the most respectable areas in sociology right now. But something like that might be, start from the undergrad and create these sort of pathways. Perhaps that might be the optimistic end here. So thank you everyone for coming. Very interesting discussion. We can probably continue talking about it over coffee, beers, and cocktails, or just water. That's fine too. Water is fine. All right. Thanks for attending.